All right, so you've probably seen all the headlines flying around about U.S. tariffs. They've been up and down. It's been a wild ride. And today we're going to really dive deep into this recent announcement about a 90-day pause on some of them. We've gone through a bunch of news reports just to try to cut through the noise and give you the real story behind this whole decision and why it actually might matter to you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can feel like it's constantly shifting, right, with these trade policies. Our goal today in this deep dive is to really try to understand, what does this 90-day pause actually mean? What's going on the ground? What might have motivated it? And what are the ripple effects that we might see, across the global economy, particularly for those countries that aren't sort of in the direct line of fire like China.
So let's get right to it then. What exactly did they announce about this 90-day pause, and who actually gets a break here?
So on April 9th, President Trump announced a 90-day pause on additional tariffs. And I think the real key here is who this applies to. And it's specifically for countries that haven't retaliated against previous U.S. tariffs. So think of it as like a temporary reprieve for those who haven't responded with their own tariffs on American goods.
Interesting. So it's not like a blanket lifting of every single tariff out there.
No, not at all. And crucially, China is excluded from this pause. In fact, while some countries are getting a break from further tariffs, for now tariffs on Chinese goods are actually being increased to a pretty substantial 125%. So this really highlights that continued focus on the trade relationship with Beijing.
Right. So all those pre-existing tariffs, those are all still in effect for most countries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The original broader tariff announcements like that proposed 10% universal levy. That's 10% on goods from most countries, regardless of existing agreements. And then the existing 25% tariffs on things like steel and aluminum and cars for many nations, all of that remains in place. This 90-day pause is only on additional tariffs that were announced more recently.
Okay, so what about a country like the UK? They were already facing a 10% tariff. Does this new pause actually change anything for them right away?
So for the UK, which was already subject to that 10% tariff, this 90-day pause doesn't mean that they'll see a reduction. Instead, it just means a temporary stop to any further tariff increases that might have been coming down the pike, so that existing cost is still there.
Okay, so the announcements, everyone's digesting it. What was the immediate reaction, especially in the financial markets?
Yeah, well, the reaction was big. U.S. stocks jumped pretty substantially right after the announcement. And it wasn't just the U.S. Global markets responded really positively. And for you, the listener, this immediate jump really signals the profound impact that even just easing trade tensions temporarily can have on investor confidence. However, as we'll see, this kind of initial wave of optimism doesn't necessarily erase some of the deeper economic anxieties that are out there.
So can you give us some specifics on how those markets actually moved?
Absolutely. So the FTSE 100, that's the UK's leading index of, UK-listed companies. It saw its fastest pace of growth in 5 years, climbing over 6%. The S&P 500 here in the US had its third best day since 1940, soaring by 9.5%. Japan's Nikkei also surged by over 9%, and European shares, as measured by the stocks 600, rose by more than 7%. So these were some pretty remarkable single-day gains.
Yeah, that really sounds like a huge sigh of relief from investors. But was everyone feeling quite that optimistic?
Well, that's a really critical point to consider, despite the, pretty widespread market rally. PIMCO, which is, a major player in bond investing, they still warned that the U.S. economy could fall into recession. And their argument is that the economic disruption that's been caused by all this recent tariff volatility, coupled with ongoing concerns about inflation, could still lead to a downturn, even with this temporary pause. So while the markets, showed this immediate positive sentiment, some of those underlying economic worries haven't really disappeared.
So the markets reacted in one way, but what about official responses from governments and policymakers? How did they respond to all of this?
Yeah, well, we saw a pretty interesting mix of reactions. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, she described the pause as, a key part of President Trump's grand negotiating strategy, asserting that the tariffs had successfully created, maximum negotiating leverage for the United States. So they're really framing this not as a change, of course, but as a strategic step.
Okay. Interesting spin on it. And what about Treasury Secretary Bessent? What did he have to say?
Well, Secretary Bessent echoed that sentiment and even suggested that the markets, initially didn't understand the administration's strategy. He emphasized that these high tariff threats were really intended to bring many countries to the negotiating table. And he believes this approach has been effective in that regard. He cited that over 75 countries are now engaging in discussions.
And what about the other side of the aisle here in the U.S.? What was their reaction?
Well, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, he expressed significant concern and confusion about the whole thing, calling out the chaos and unpredictability of the policy. And he argued that the primary negative impact falls on the American public, those consumers and businesses that are facing all this uncertainty and potential price increases.
Okay, shifting gears a bit over to Europe, what were some of those initial reactions there?
Well, in Ireland, Tennessee Simon Harris welcomed the pause, calling it a relief to many businesses in Ireland and an opportunity for meaningful engagement. However, he also pointed out that even the existing 10% tariff isn't good. So, indicating that while the pause on further increases is a positive thing, the underlying cost is still a concern for businesses in Ireland.
Okay, and what about some of the larger European economies like Germany? What were they saying?
Well, Germany's likely next chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he interpreted the pause as a sign that a united European stance on trade was actually having a positive influence. So the idea here is that this collective pressure from the EU may have contributed to the U.S. decision to pause these further tariff increases for most countries. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, he urged all parties to really utilize these 90 days, constructively emphasizing the importance of strong transatlantic ties.
And what was the official word from the EU itself?
Well, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the pause an important step towards stabilizing the global economy. And she reiterated the EU's long-held goal of, achieving a zero-for-zero tariff agreement with the United States. So signaling their continued commitment to negotiating, a more stable and open trade relationship.
Okay, so we can't overlook China in all this, especially since they're the ones facing those higher tariffs.
Yeah.
What was their reaction to this sort of two-pronged approach?
Yeah, well, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jin stated very clearly that their response to U.S. tariffs will continue to the end, and they accused the U.S. of, acting solely out of selfish interests, and emphasized that, China has also increased its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, now reaching 84%. So while, many countries are seeing this pause, the trade conflict between the U.S. and China appears to be intensifying.
So this really does seem like a very deliberate strategy.
Yeah.
What do you see as the main underlying motivations for, this very selective pause and this increased pressure on China?
Yeah, well, the primary motivation seems to be intent by the U.S. to try to isolate the trade conflict and really focus its pressure on China. President Trump's comment about other countries getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid, suggests that, concerns and pushback from these nations might have influenced the decision to offer this temporary reprieve.
Yippy is certainly a word choice.
Yeah.
What do you think that tells us?
It suggests a level of, unease or perhaps even, significant concern being voiced by these countries about the potential impact of, further tariffs on their economies. And by offering this pause, the U.S. may be aiming to reduce kind of the broader global trade tensions while maintaining a hardline stance against China, citing, their ongoing trade practices and retaliatory measures as the justification for the increased tariffs.
And we touched on the concerns for Irish businesses earlier. Are those concerns alleviated at all by this pause?
Well, while the pause on additional tariffs, will be a relief, those existing concerns about the impact of the initial tariff announcements on Irish businesses, they remain. And as Tanaste Harris pointed out, even a 10% tariff creates challenges. And, furthermore, that potential for future tariffs on pharmaceuticals is still a major worry for Ireland, given, the significant role as a pharmaceutical exporter to the U.S. And President Trump did specifically mention plans for a major tariff on pharmaceuticals in the near future.
So that uncertainty has got to be a real challenge for businesses trying to plan for the future.
Absolutely. And some analysts believe that, even if these pauses for, countries other than China, even if those become permanent, the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy in recent years might have already caused some lasting negative effects. And this could lead countries to seek, greater strategic independence from the U.S. in their trade relationships in the long term, regardless of these temporary measures.
So for our listener, how does all this actually translate into real world impacts on businesses and consumers? Like, how does this affect their lives?
Yeah, well, the ongoing volatility in tariff policies, it just creates this climate of uncertainty for businesses, which makes long-term planning and investment really difficult. And even with a pause on some tariffs, the existing levies on various goods can still increase costs for businesses. And those costs often get passed on to consumers, in the form of higher prices for everyday goods. The increased tariffs on China are also likely to lead to, further shifts in global supply chains, potentially leading to higher prices or, limited availability for certain products. And the prospect of pharmaceutical tariffs could have, really significant and direct consequences for healthcare costs and the pharmaceutical industry globally.
And what about that initial positive jump that we saw in the markets?
Well, yeah, while that provided a short-term boost, it's important to remember that, the fundamental economic concerns like the risk of recession and persistent inflation, those haven't really disappeared. The
Yep.
situation remains really fluid, and the long-term economic consequences of these trade policies are still unfolding.
So to kind of bring it all together, where do we stand right now with all these tariffs, as of today?
Well, we're seeing a temporary break on further tariff increases for many countries, which offers a window for potential negotiations. However, significant trade tensions persist, particularly with China, where tariffs are actually going up and the existing tariffs continue to have an impact, and the overall, global trade landscape remains uncertain and subject to, potentially rapid changes.
And for you, the listener, yeah, it's clear that these international trade developments aren't just, abstract economic theories. They have the potential to influence everything from, the value of your investments to the prices you pay at the store.
Yeah.
And it really underscores just how interconnected our global economy is.
Yeah, and this leads to, a really important question for you to consider. Given the sudden shift in approach, this, a pause for most, but increased pressure on China, what does this 90-day window really represent? Is it a genuine move towards de-escalation and more stable trade relationships in the long run, or is it simply a tactical maneuver within a larger, more complex, and potentially unpredictable trade strategy? And what strategic decisions might businesses and governments be making right now in response to this temporary reprieve and this ongoing uncertainty?
We hope this deep dive has provided you with a clear understanding of this complex and evolving situation. And if you found this valuable and want to stay informed on future developments and in-depth analyses like this, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to support our work.